Hello, and welcome to this webinar where we're going to be talking with key members of several successful open source projects that are making huge contributions to cybersecurity as a whole. In this conversation, we're going to learn about what inspired these projects, how they came to be, how they are trying to grow, and any lessons, good or bad, they've learned along the way. It takes a lot of passion, courage, and vision to embark on an open source adventure, and I'm incredibly honored to be hosting this webinar. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy day to be here with us. I know there are a lot of things competing for your attention, but we feel this is a valuable conversation and are very glad that you're here. If any questions come up during the talk, you can add them to the chat window of the specific platform you're watching this from. We will try and answer any questions as they come in and can address any that we didn't get to at the end. I would like to thank our panelists for being here with us today. They're all very busy people, and we're very lucky to have them sharing this valuable knowledge with us. My name is Christopher Luft. I am one of the co-founders at LimaCharlie, and I'll be moderating the conversation. To get things started, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, tell us about their open source project, and tell us about their open source project. Zach, why don't you start, and then Leonard, and then Peter.
Absolutely. I'm Zach Wasserman. Today I'm the CTO at Fleet Device Management, which is an open core company based around OS Query, which is an open source project that I helped create at Facebook back in 2014. So I have kind of a dual role between a very security focused open source project and an open core company built around that.
I am Leonard Koopman. I'm the founder of Greylog. Greylog is an open source project I started back in 2009, so a pretty long time ago. It started as a fairly simple log management solution. So you would send it all your logs in the beginning from your applications. Then we extended that so you could send from your operating systems, your network hardware, all kinds of other sources. For, I want to say, God, well, it's 2022, for probably 6 or 7 years now. We're also, I think, very, very common in the security space. We've added some additional data sources, some other features, so you can use this log management a little more like some people would use a SIM or a ZIM, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Yeah, that's what we do. Very active in the community. You'll find us every year at DEF CON, sponsoring multiple parties. That's always a great way to find me.
Awesome. Peter?
Hi, my name is Peter Manef. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Stramus Networks. I'm also a member of the Executive Council of the Open Information Security Foundations, which is actually the umbrella foundation, nonprofit NGO, US-based organization over Suricata, which Suricata is an open source IDS, IPS network security monitoring engine. The code is located on GitHub. We have our roots from there. At Stamos with Eric, my colleague and co-founder at Stamos Networks, and that's where we actually met in the project during the project Suricata. And I've been truly thankful and very lucky to be part of the Suricata community and everybody involved. And thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. Zach, I'll start with you. What is it that inspired OS Query? How did it initially get started, and what was behind the decision to make it an open source project?
Yeah, absolutely. So what inspired OS Query was actually a guy named Mike Arpaia came to Facebook in 2014 with a vision to build OS Query. He wanted to build something that defenders could use on macOS and Linux, which were severely underserved at that time by endpoint security software. And he wanted to make it easy for IT analysts to use. So not having to write code, which the systems of the time typically tended to be like they could execute Python scripts or something like that. We wanted to make something more accessible. And lastly, wanted to make it open source because one, we love open source and the philosophy around that. But really, I think it's about kind of the legacy and the impact that's possible with the project. We could have built something internally at Facebook that would have been deployed quite widely. It's a big company, but the impact is so much broader when you're able to go to a worldwide audience. You're able to engage with people and help to solve the problems at other organizations. And we were lucky to have support from management who believed in that vision as well. And at the time, Facebook was also releasing wildly successful open source projects like React in the development space and stuff. So it was luckily not a hard sell to make those capabilities and that code base something that we could open source. And I believe we got it open sourced within about 6 months of starting the development. So it was an early priority and something that we got done quite quickly.
Very cool. Leonard, how about you? What inspired Graylog, and what was behind the decision to make it an open source project?
I was a very, very junior developer. And I wonder sometimes if what I know now, compared between kind of the time that has passed since 2009 and 2022, almost 2023, man, it's almost December. I wonder if I would still make the same decision, because basically I was looking for a log management solution at a job that I was working at back then, and there was a few. I'm not going to name names, but you probably heard about all of those few that were already very popular back then, and they were just unbelievably expensive. They were way more than what we could have ever afforded, and so. Being a very junior developer, I said, well, I'm just going to build it myself. It can't be that hard, right? You need what do you need? You need to somehow accept these logs on the network. Yeah, okay. And then you have to write them in a database and put a web front end on top of it. That can't be, that's not much, right? It shouldn't take longer than 2 weeks. So that was 2009. We're still not done. We're more than 130 people working at this company. So we're still not done, right? So I started it because I needed it. I needed it for myself. I was looking for a learning project anyways, because like I said, it was very junior. This was exciting, right? Something I'd never done before. Let's go. I think it was 20, I was 21, and you have a lot of energy. You don't have any commitments, nothing, so you're just like, yeah, I'm going to build this in my free time, no problem. And so it wasn't even a question. It wasn't an active decision for me even to make this open source, because it was entirely clear that I would make this open source, because why would you not, right? I had zero commercial or business intentions with that at all. And I thought, yeah, that's fun. Maybe others can use it. Fantastic. And it turns out others started to use it. And it's funny because I think it started the same month that Jordan the Sizzle started Logstash, which is also very popular, right? So I think we started within 2 weeks or so. We both had the same problem, and we both just created something to do that. Because we met a few years later in Berlin. It was very interesting to share those early stories. But yeah, that's why. Honestly, it was entirely clear for me that I'm not going to keep this for myself, and I want people to use it, and I want the feedback from the people who use it. I didn't even think about community at that point. I was just, if I put it on GitHub, and it was very early GitHub in 2009. If I put it on there, people might see it and use it, and that's awesome. That honestly, for the first years, that's what kept me motivated, because people used it and liked it. That's something I wouldn't underestimate for when you get started with something open source. I think that it keeps you going when people use it and just tell you that they like it or what they use it for. And that's why it started. I needed something, and of course I make it open source. I'm never going to sell any of this. This is fine. Yeah, that's my story.
Oh, that's great. Peter, I'm going to extend the same question to you. What inspired Suricata, and what was behind the decision to make it open source?
So Suricata was actually open source by birth, to be very honest. So it was actually back in the day, Victor Julian, Matt Yonkman, and Will Metcalf, I think, were the initial group behind the project. Suricata originally started as a DHS-funded initiative. Back then, DHS had this funding for different open source projects. It was a good initiative, and that was 2008. And I think one of the reasons why the first push of code was, December 31st, 2008 was because that was the deadline. And So there were many projects that DHS, at least open source project that DHS back then funded. It was like a fund that is no longer there, but Suricata was the only, if I'm not mistaken, the only open source project that survived today. And actually, one of the reasons why Suricata survived, I believe, is that it was open source, which actually enabled it to have a lot of feedback and early adoption by community. And that's really what kept us going as well, because people were coming back with requests, coming back with bug reports, coming back with some feedback. That's just to reiterate what Leonard mentioned. That's what keeps you going at 10 p.m., at 2 a.m., at noon. It's this kind of unspoken things like, let me try to fix, let me try to help to help out. That community around you really is what fuels all the initiative back then as well. Today, a lot of commercial and also non-commercial solutions are based on Suricata. That by itself is rewarding enough, I must admit. So I had the pleasure and the luck of being part of the initial journey, and still be part of the team and such a great bunch of people.
Oh, that's really great. I love the Genesis stories. They're one of my favorites. I'm going to throw this one out to the group. If somebody out there has a good idea and wants to go the open source route to see if they can bring it to life, what's the best way to get started? Is it build it and they will come, or do you have to be proactive, market the idea? How do you get that initial inertia?
I can start maybe. I think it's a little bit of both. You will definitely need to go out and tell people that this exists, right? I think that's actually something cool about open source, is that when you start it, you're going to be responsible for absolutely everything. You're going to learn a little bit about marketing. You're going to learn a little bit about legal. You should definitely pick a license very consciously and not just grab the one that you've heard about, because they all seem to be the same from a user perspective. If you never have to dive too deeply into it, you just know it's free and it's open. But you should definitely take care when it comes to choosing a license. And luckily, there's a lot of resources out there for it now. But I think to get it started, what worked for me was I built a website and I put some effort into that, because still you need to tell people what this is about, right? You still need to be able to explain why someone might be interested in using this. And I think the other thing that I did is I went to a lot of user groups. So I back then I was still living, so actually where I grew up, in Hamburg in Germany, and there's another user group for something IT related every day. It's very dense, very European kind of dense city. So I was just going to one user group after another and just showed it, which is why in the beginning it got very popular with the Ruby community of all communities somehow, because I was writing a little bit of Ruby back then, and I built the first connector to be Ruby and went to the local Ruby user group and showed it, right? And so that's where it started. There were a ton of Ruby users and Rails users. But I think you also, besides telling people about it and having a website you can point them to where they can learn what this thing is about and why they might want to use it, I think you also have to, and this is where honestly some open source software is lacking, you have to put effort into making it easy to use as well. Just because it's open source doesn't mean that people suddenly put up with tons of time and tons of extra effort. It doesn't have to be as good as a product built by a company that has entire teams that take care of the UX and the onboarding process, right? But still, it has to be maintainable, it has to be somewhat easy to install. There has to be good and complete documentation, because I think eventually your community and your user base is going to grow when you hit this magic moment of there's a bunch of people out there who like it and who really like it and who feel good about recommending it to their friends and their peers. And that's when it suddenly starts to spread like a wildfire. But you have to set that up. You have to arm them with the right arguments on why this is good. And you have to arm them with a good onboarding experience, with good documentation, good screenshots, and put some love into it. Which is actually, I think, a big difference between, I look at open source software in two different ways. There's one that is truly built as an open source project for others to use, which is This is not hyper specialized with super complex architecture where someone just had something and then open sourced it. I think there's another approach which I think is important, which is the one that I followed so far, is you build it for other people to use it. So you make architectural decisions to keep it simple. You make architectural decisions to make sure that the dependencies don't go crazy, that what you install is actually easy to use. And that's why I moved off of Ruby on Rails eventually, because I loved it and I knew how to set that thing up. But if you've never done that before, that's a hurdle, and that's why people didn't use it. And so I switched over to other things for that. I think that's something, these two things together, if you have a good project and something people want to solve, I think then you're going to see success out there.
That's great.
Yeah, and I think that the biggest thing here is make sure that you are solving a real problem that people have. And I think that the easiest way to do this is, like Lennart said earlier, solve your problem. So whether that's you independently as a consultant or contractor, or just something that you're genuinely interested in, or even better, if it's your employer's problem or your job, your problem in your current role, if you can find a way to take the knowledge that you have from performing that role, the understanding that you have of the problem, and then use the resources of your employer to do that initial development, use the real world test bed that you have for understanding whether your solution is actually solving the problem. And starting from that direction, I think gives you a huge leg up, because ultimately, I think it's absolutely not the case that if you build it, they will come, unless it's solving that problem. It's something that people are hungry for a solution for. And then I think absolutely other things that Lennart mentioned, like making sure the onboarding experience is good, making sure that the thing is understandable, easy to deploy. Those are absolutely important. And there's almost like an inverse correlation where the more desperately people want to solve this problem, or the more value that this solution can bring them, the more pain that they can work through in the deployment and the onboarding and the understanding and that kind of thing. And sometimes the nature of the problem is going to be that there's not an easy way to do this, and making sure that it is a really good and well-motivated problem helps to get through those early times. And then later you can devote some of those resources to improving that onboarding, improving the understanding, and those kind of things.
So I'll share a story actually of what actually worked for us on both an open source and a commercial level. So I totally agree. The documentation needs to be in place. It's a tough job to fill in because you have different user level experiences, right? You have the new early adopters. You have some users that are that they're very well experienced, and they can pretty much do a lot of things by themselves. But you also need to that part we're not worried about because those users are so-called power users, so they can pretty much plow through anything. They have the experience. The part where you would actually might need to help and show less experienced users or young users what is the benefit of it and why, that's actually helps a lot. So Eric and I, we're co-founders of Stamos Networks, right? We do a network detection and response solution. So, but that's entirely based on Suricata. But Eric and I met via the Suricata project, and how we started was basically as Suricata was gathering momentum, people kept us asking us, "Hey, can you help us out with this project for 2 months, for 5 months? Help us out here and there." And eventually we said, "Okay, well, let's actually officialize it and try to make a company out of it." So basically, very roughly, that's how it started. But as we have our roots in open source, we said, well, while we're doing that, let's also make it useful to organizations, people that cannot actually afford it, for example, or cannot afford support and similar things. And so we made an open source distro called Celx that is based on Suricata. So we open source that as well, and we put it out there and say, hey, This is for anybody that wants to use it, but our aim was mainly students, trainings, universities, non-profit organizations, and similar things, just to help out. It was all packaged in one, ready to go. But effectively, what we actually did was showcase it, make a use case out of it. So here is what you can do. Here's an example, at least an idea, an example, a working example, and how you can implement it. And criticism, feedback is always welcome. That's one thing that you have to really be open to. And it's those types of communities and people that thrive, actually. You need to be open to criticism. You cannot have a closed mind. You have to know that there's users in probably all time zones. Everybody has their own use case that is peculiar. You cannot solve all the problems, but you need to be open to all the feedback and criticism, because that's actually what, as I mentioned earlier, that's what keeps you going, and ultimately actually improves the project. That feedback, that anything that we've taken as bug reports, as feature requests, as anything like that, that's what has helped the project actually grow and be more useful ultimately back to the community. Yeah, absolutely. If you open the communication too via different channels, I mean, back in the day it was IRC, right? So you cannot really share screenshots and things like that, but it was good for to explain the screenshot and similar things. So that actually also helps a lot, and it was good to see. Then the real reward came actually when you see other people starting to answer instead of maintainers and things like that. So that's when you actually have a community, you have somebody has your back there, and that has no monetary value to it. That is irreplaceable.
Yeah, that's great.
There are a bunch of features and things in the product today that some people really, really, really like, that keep on coming up. And they started, I remember 10 years ago, as a feature request from a community member. That's part of this power of open source. You're going to have so many eyes on your product so early. And also when people get something for free, they are actually very likely to give you feedback, even if they don't continue to use it. They will often tell you why they don't continue to use it, and they'll be open to come back to it maybe at some point. I will say that having our first paid customers many, many years ago adds another dimension to this. This is where you get the more like the smaller pieces of feedback about details, something where like, okay, I got this for free. I'm not going to complain about this one weird little thing,
right,
which, however, turned out to be really important in production for many. So that's the other thing. If you want to commercialize it, I believe personally, it's important to also get a paying customer. Maybe it's just one or two as early as possible, because the moment they gave you any amount of money, the conversation entirely changes.
Right.
But yeah, I completely agree. That feedback is absolutely invaluable, and you have to keep that open. And you have to accept that through as many channels as possible. Completely agree.
That's a great segue into my next question. Writing code and maintaining a project is incredibly time consuming. And no matter how passionate we are about a particular idea, most people want to be able to eat and pay rent. Assuming somebody can get that initial momentum going, what are some of the different ways they can generate revenue to support themselves to continue working on the project?
Yeah, in my experience with both OS Query and Fleet, consulting was a really useful way to do this. So I would work with organizations to help them do deployments of the tools. I would work with them on feature requests, and typically not bug fixes. That was something I always tried to do for free, but building new features, I think having someone be motivated enough that they're willing to pay for something really says a lot about the reality of their need. And a really important thing to try to look out for if you are a maintainer of one of these kind of projects is, make sure that the clients that you're working with are committed to getting those changes upstream. So luckily I worked with some great clients and was always able to get the changes upstream, but I think that it is definitely worth paying attention to the clauses in any contracts that you sign, and regardless of what the contracts say, just the intentions of the individuals that you're working with. Do people understand that it's important, to you and to them and to the health of the project that these things make it into the upstream.
I also think as part of actually one fundamental, at least from my point of view, one fundamental critical point originally when an open source project is created of any kind is actually, I think, I just want to piggyback on what Leonard said previously, the original license. That would carry with the project for a long time. And that's not something that, if after an open source project is widely adopted, it's not exactly something you want to touch, you want to change at all. So this is one of those moments where actually you need to really well kind of have a strategic view of what and where you want to go and why have you chosen to put a specific license in place. And I'm saying there's a lot of open source projects, but they have different licenses, right? You have LGPL, GPL, BSD, all those sorts of things, and they have slight different variations. And depending on what you do, you might choose one or the other. But at least from our perspective, that has proven to be essential, because a couple of ways that open source projects can make money. Of course, you need to pay developers. Of course, they need to be maintained. Of course, you have to make sure that it works on 16,000 different OSs, and all sorts of architectures, and in and out of the cloud, and anywhere you want to plug it. So that takes a lot of, sure, it takes a lot of resources. But one thing that, a couple of things that are always useful is probably, so if you offer support for certain levels of support, let's say, or the possibility for donation versus non-commercial license and all that stuff. So that actually also helps a lot. It's not the only two possibilities, but there are possibilities out there. Of course, if you rally the community really behind, and if there's a big community, you also get so you can get help via a lot of different ways. So it might be just different organizations, so users donating code or deciding to maintain a specific section or a sub-module of the code. That helps a lot as well. Or you can actually have donations and help from different organizations, governments, and similar things. So there are ways. You have to work, of course, at it. It's not just something that will just fall out of the sky. You have to work at it. But you have to work at it via building a strong and stable community, and be open to, and be open to bashing, be open to ideas, be open to the feedback. Always know that there's something behind that question that actually triggered. It's something that you're not exposed to, you don't know it, or it's not related to your environment, your setup, and similar things. That's what makes it so versatile. That's what makes it so interesting. You always, I personally, I like it because there was something new that I learned. I don't know it all. I like to learn more. Still learning.
I think for the very, very initial phases, I agree with Zach that the consulting can get you help off the ground. The cool thing about that is consulting, compared to support contracts, consulting usually comes without SLAs, right? That comes with a schedule you can plan somehow, and it comes in smaller chunks. It's not a 1-year commitment to get up in the middle of the night because there's an issue with your software somewhere, right? I think if you're just one person and you're getting started, I would say it's almost impossible to provide support for, at least at the levels that many customers would want, right? So then you might be better in just selling blocks of consulting hours. I personally like that idea a lot. But it will only get you started because it's something that's really hard to scale also, Something I'm personally curious about that I see more is donations. I see people who make sustainable living with donations, right? For very, very popular open source projects. I hope that more and more companies that use open source projects will donate to the open source software that they're using. Even without getting anything in return, so to say, because they're already getting the whole software in return, right? So even without additional consulting or anything like that, or prioritization or anything, I hope more of that happens. And then I think personally, I believe that once you've reached you need a minimal scale for that. There's my dog in the background. She's part husky, and I think the male lady is outside, so she's of course got to make sure she knows. A thing that I think you can do, I believe you can do even in earlier stages of your scale. You have to be more than one person, obviously, but I think a really interesting monetization strategy is cloud, offering your software, depending on what kind of software it is. But I mean, if your software is a JavaScript library, I think cloud hosting gets a little tricky. But if you run anything like infrastructure software or something like that, if that's what you're building, I think that one of the things that people will always be open to pay for is to not having to care about maintenance, updates, stability, scalability, all of that. So my favorite example of that is MongoDB. I think they have done an absolutely fantastic job starting out with support and consulting, then going into real support contracts, and then going into an enterprise offering, so open core basically. And then they went into their cloud strategy. And from what I can see, I mean, they're publicly traded now. From what I can see, they're doing absolutely fantastic with that, because people don't want to run their own databases, right? I get that. But they still like the flexibility. If they ever had to stop using a cloud service, they could simply go back and run it themselves again. Or the other way around. They run it themselves in the beginning because it's cheap and easy. And then once it gets more production critical, they start to move into the cloud, but it's the same software. So they just run a migration and show the change the endpoint basically of it. I find that super interesting. That is something that we as Greylock do. We offer Greylock Cloud because it scales really nicely and it provides real value for the users. But even there, of course, the question is the license, right? What is there and I might be opening a can of worms here, but there is something like the SSPL, for example, a license that has been designed to keep, that basically gives you all the freedoms of the GPL, but does not allow a user or company, anyone, to offer you a software as a service. It's like an AGPL on steroids, basically. Now there's been a lot of arguing about that, and we made that switch when we started to offer Greylock Cloud. We went from GPL3 to the SSPL because we didn't want to have other cloud hosters suddenly compete with us without ever paying us anything, you know.
Right.
And you can still make that work. There's some companies that run this at a smaller scale. They reached out and said, "Oh man, now we have to stop using this." We said, "No, we'll cut you, like you pay us like $1 or something." I'm making this up, but you pay us like $1 or something, and you get a formal license, and you can still do that because we're not competing, you know. But right. If a large cloud hoster would come around the corner and ask if they could do that, that'd probably be a different story. And I think that's the reality in open source today. And again, comes back to a license you got to pick. And I agree, changing licenses is no fun. You want to think this through when you start.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to look at the business model when you're thinking about scaling beyond one or a couple of folks working on an open source project. So what we've done at Fleet is we've adopted the buyer-based open core model, something that Sid Sibrandy, the CEO and founder of GitLab, talks about a lot, and that they use as a model for deciding, you know, what goes into a free tier and what goes into a paid tier. So it's important. I think it's really important to make sure that whatever you do, it's a strategy that scales if you want to build an organization that scales. So things like support can be tricky to scale because you have to input a person's time, an individual's time into support. Whereas if you're building a cloud like Leonard described, you've got scale there. You can scale with SREs, with operations people, or if you're doing sort of the buyer-based open core model where, like we do at Fleet, where the code is all source available. Some of it is fully open source under the MIT license, and others are under our commercial license where we ask people to buy, to pay for the devices that they use. And that again enables us to scale an engineering organization to build value into both the free and the paid products. So I think looking at these different pricing and different business models around open source and making sure that you're conscious about what sort of scaling you're enabling with the way that you set up your company is quite important.
Great stuff. Successful open source projects often have diverse and active communities. How do you manage these projects to keep everybody pulling in the same direction? Is there specific communication tools? And how do you manage between people who are contributing from out in the community to people that are core to the project?
For us, this is a story in two phases. The first phase was there was no company. It was basically just me working on it. And then the first contributors started to appear and they built stuff. And the very first ones built something that made no sense for the product and the roadmap. They just needed it and they built it and they sent a pull request for it. And then it's painful to tell them that I'm not going to merge this because it makes no sense for the roadmap. And I don't want to maintain this going forward. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing that I believe fits very well. What I started doing was I started to put the roadmap very publicly for the next 2 releases or so, and these were all the tickets. And I was more asking for people to pick something of this. Right. If you want to contribute, if you want to do something just to contribute, here's a bunch of stuff that needs work. What do you think? You just go and pick something of that. And then, of course, you have things where people work on something because they need it, right? And I've always encouraged people to reach, if part of the interest to build it is a hope to get it merged, get the code merged into the project, to before they start working on that, to reach out to me and let's talk this through. If this makes sense, if maybe in another way it would make more sense, just to increase the chances of it in the end being merged. But then also I think it's you have to be somewhat strict, and also just some stuff you just won't merge, because it doesn't make sense. It can't be this idea that everyone writes something so it ends up in the core, because then it's going to become unmaintainable. Absolutely, no matter how good the code is, just all these feature saves are going to stop making sense in their combination at some point. So that's always to make me feel less bad about rejecting something. I always said, let's talk about this first. Try and make this very clear on the GitHub page. Like, hey, if you plan to build something, here are 5 different channels you can reach me, right? Just let's talk about it. And then what happened after is when I started the company, I hired most of the people who were contributors. And we do that today. If someone starts contributing a lot and it's good stuff, we make them a job offer. So we kind of keep the direction that way. And we kept on doing all the other stuff, like talk to us before we build something, all of that. But that's special. That works for us because we've also never set up to become a committee-driven, foundation-owned kind of open source project. I think for those it's very different. I know that's something that sits under the Cloud Native Foundation, under the Linux Foundation, something like that. They are starting this very differently from the beginning because they're going to have so many contributors they can't hire all of them. They have all these. What I see work really well for the open source project right now, for example, we love to work with. They do all their planning and all their stuff in the open. They have these weekly meetings that are open to everyone. It's just a Zoom link, right? Everybody who's interested, come join us, And I see that work pretty well so far over there. But I think there's this early decision also you got to make. Do I want to make this a project that I run and I take contributions, and maybe there's a core group of a few people who work on something, or is this going to be something that is truly like this classic idea, like the Linux kernel, like this classic idea of a huge open source community that has all this governance around it and all these things.
600 different versions of Linux.
Yeah. So I decided early on that I wanted to do the second thing, which is I wanted to keep the control a little tighter. But through that, also build a more focused project. But that's a decision you're going to make, and then also stick to it. You can't have both, right? You can't want to have all the control and then also expect that 600 people come and contribute stuff all the time. So it's tough. It's ongoing communication, I guess, is my answer in a nutshell.
What I can relate at least from the early days, that my experience anyway, what I saw in the project, in this Recover project, was actually very interesting. So first of all, there's a couple of things that were kind of interesting. We still, some of the users that are part of the community back then are still now users, of course, and power users and so on. But it's funny how if you go back in time, on GitHub or on Redmine, when I would see the feature requests or the bug reports, see how their feature request changes with time, because they actually do different parts of the job. But one thing you ought to be careful about is always an open source project that let's say doesn't have all the resources for developers that we want or that the project wants, is that if you accept a feature that you have nobody dedicated to support it, you might end up actually sort of kind of damaging the project. Not in such a brutal bad way, but I'm saying if you accept a feature and users start using it and there's no actually active support of that feature or that submodule, then you actually put the whole project at risk. There is a chance for that too. So I agree, a clear communication is easier. A lot of our users, including from the early adopters from the early days, actually like to be involved. Believe it or not, people actually like to help out, and it gives them also a special recognition and status. And so part of the communication is also to recognize the effort others are putting into into the open source project as well, and make it well known and be like, thank you, people and organizations, for actually supporting us via all sorts of different ways and means. No, but I agree. One thing of clear communication. Communication can be done via many ways. Back in the day, it was just mail or forum or something like that, or IRC. Now there is a lot more kind of different forums, all sorts of social media platforms, channels, Slack, Discord, Mattermost, you name it. It's all there. It's much easier to communicate, highlight, or get in contact with somebody if you need to. But after you, if you have a clear communication in line of what is expected from a contributor, in a very simple terms, okay, let's talk about this feature. This is the reason why we want it like that. What's your reason? And you meet in the middle, kind of. But the most important thing is to have that before the actual contribution is done, because when you also have a chance, have an opportunity, if the actual contribution is done and then you start talking about it, then you might lose a lot of time. Back and forth and fixing things and going through the whole architectural part as well. So an advice for early adopters is please do get into contact. Your ideas are always welcome and great. But there's always some caveats and always like aha moments and things like that. So it's definitely setting up guidelines of what a feature or how a PR should be done and what's the reason and the explanations and formats and commit structures and QA tests and all that. That once a user organization goes through that to submit a code, then they start to realize, it's actually a good thing to start to realize how serious this project is. So it's serious. You don't want to just merge stuff. That will actually backfire. You'll start finding bugs or a couple of weeks later and similar things, because you want, of course, the project to be stable, and to be, by meaning stable, is like useful to the end user, right? Nobody's going to run it if it breaks all the time. So part of the real sometimes why you have to be difficult or tough, let's say, so to speak. But as early as possible as you can do the communication, the better. And users will actually like it. They'll love it. I've met a lot of people that actually like to be part of that, of a project or of a group, or then they become actually ones that give advice to the next generation, the younger contributors, and it's amazing. It's just really amazing. There is no replacement of that, for example, in the commercial world. And often enough, for example, in the Suricata project, we also had donations. And one of the reasons for a donation of a code, let's say, is because it will get tested much more than you ever be possible to do in your lab. So that's irreplaceable as well.
Great.
And I have experience with kind of both models, the foundation and committee based approach, which we use at OSQuery, and which OSQuery these days is a project of the Linux Foundation, and then the sort of company directed approach, which we use at Fleet. And certainly there's trade-offs for each of them. If you do the company directed approach, you can move a lot quicker because you don't have to reach consensus for all of the decision making, and that can be a real advantage for sure. I think it allows you more sort of control end to end of the experience that users will have as they start to interact with your project, and that can be really huge for improving, you know, some of the things that we talked about earlier. On the other hand, the foundation kind of model has advantages in terms of resiliency. I would say, you know, when you get more contributors from more different organizations into a committee together, then losing one contributor, one organization doesn't mean the end of that open source project. And I think with that, you also get the advantage that you know, as with the Linux kernel, the project can be sort of the kernel for more pieces of software or more companies that folks are building. So we see that with OS Query, where I would say many, if not most, of the major security vendors now have products that integrate OS Query. And I think that that's enabled in a large part because it's more of a foundation-based model.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting stuff. An argument that's often put forward against open source as a way of developing software is that it's less secure because bad actors can see how it works and engineer ways to attack. On the other side of this, many people say that these projects, if run properly, are more secure than their closed source counterparts because of that transparency. What are your thoughts on this? Is there specific things you can recommend fledgling open source projects do to make sure they maintain the highest level of security?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't buy the security through obscurity argument, that just because, you know, you've got everything covered up, that people aren't going to find the weaknesses in there. And I think that one of the really cool things about being an open source project is the transparency that being open source kind of forces also tends to push you towards, I think, the best practices and towards
Mhm.
being more honest with ourselves as developers about, are we doing the right things? Because people will scrutinize these things, and not only will they scrutinize these things, they'll find issues, and we'll have to be very public about addressing them. And I think through all of that, we come to both better discipline, but also a better you know, high watermark, I'd say, of the security practices within the project.
I agree, and it could actually be much from that respect as well. Open source bug reporting, or you know, exploit CVEs being reported like that for open source project, he actually has, in some cases, much higher responsibility and puts a lot more pressure on the project. So if a project is mature enough, that they will respond, at least from what I've seen and from my experience, they will respond accordingly. So, and it's amazing sometimes how these open source projects can actually man up and be more proactive, more communicative, and more responsive to their exploits than actually, let's say, commercial counterparts, which you actually subscribe to. Not to say that one is better than the other or similar things. I'm just saying one is an open model. But the fact whether you're open source or not doesn't save you really from exploits and CVs. We have plenty of examples of both. So I mean, you cannot really say one is higher than the other or less than that. It's just different, basically a different model. I don't personally think that just because your code is open source, you're more prone to CVEs or exploits or hacks or similar things. Sometimes the open source projects it could be a million lines of code. I mean, good luck trying to figure that one out, honestly. So it has pros and cons, as with anything, as with everything. I think it's not really a matter of commercial versus non-commercial and all that stuff. I just personally, to reiterate, mean that it's open source project have actually a lot more pressure on them to deliver on time and fix things as fast as possible, just because it's actually open source, and there's a lot of users there, and everybody's watching what your response is going to be. So you have that responsibility to do it. It could be a lot of pressure too, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I agree with everything said. I think the only thing I would add is, as a open source project that is used by people, you have some responsibility. Maybe not a legal responsibility, because the license usually handles that, right? But you have, I think, a responsibility to deliver software that follows security practices, right? Cool thing that I've noticed over the last years is that more and more security vendors allow you to use things for free if you have a true and purely open source project. So when it comes to, I'm thinking about supply chain security, right? Your entire all the dependencies that you have. I think over the last few years, it has become standard to have some sort of scanning on those, and to have some sort of alerting about insecure vulnerabilities that you might have, insecure libraries with vulnerabilities that you might currently compile into your code. You, of course, still have a responsibility to take care of that, or to at least say this is no longer an active project. You can keep the code out there, make very clear that, hey, I'm no longer maintaining this. You're kind of on your own, or maybe someone wants to pick it up. It doesn't mean that you're now forever kind of bound to this and you can never get rid of this project again. You can, there are abandoned open source projects out there, but I think it's your responsibility also to actively abandon it and not to just let it linger there and you have a bunch of people who use crazy outdated software, right? So I like that. I mean, if you develop on GitHub, they're moving more and more, just like GitLab. I think they're moving more and more into providing that entire tool chain to you. I mean, you can just turn on their scanning, and you get notifications about security vulnerabilities that they're finding. And then, you need a good process to handle these reports when they come in. There is a standard, the security file on GitHub. I don't know if GitLab follows that, but on GitHub, you can create a security.md and put some guidelines in how people can report security vulnerabilities securely to you. And GitHub will pick that up and show that. And there's a lot of best practices from the large projects out there to follow, I think.
Awesome. Great answers. I know we're coming up on time, so I only have one more question for you. And this is really, do you have any advice for people looking to start their open source project, like things you wish you had known if you could go back in time and talk to yourself when you were first writing that first line of code?
I've so many things. I'm wondering if there's anything open source specific. I mean, I'm off the, oh God, you had so much to learn back in 2009. In so many ways. And I don't know. I feel like I always come back to, let's go full circle, go back to your first question. I still don't say that build it and they will come, but also if this is your side project, you do this in your free time, go build something that solves your own problems and have fun doing it. And I think then you're on a really, really good path already. But if you have any intentions to ever make this in any way commercial or make any sort of money with it, then think about that up front a little bit, at least. Make a little bit of a plan. I think that would be my advice, because I definitely got the second part wrong, and there was a lot of stuff that we had to fix down the road. And some of that is a little painful.
I would say you also have to, probably one thing, among the things that you need to think about is, okay, so is this like a side project that you actively intend to kind of keep an eye on, maintain? Does it solve some small issue? Or you actually intend to actually be at it for the long term, as opposed to, I just want to throw a bunch of code in there. Maybe someone wants to pick it up. That's okay too. Just coming back to what Leonard was mentioning, licensing, I think it's very important. But solve a real case problem, or try to, and get all the feedback possible. But have clear lines of communications established. Even if you don't intend to be 24/7 on the keyboards and all that stuff, just have some clear guidance, clear licensing in mind in the project as well. Clear contribution agreements and similar things. So how to contribute and what to do. And if somebody wants to reach out to you and ask you like a private kind of off the grid question, make sure you have that line there too. So for example, there's plenty of channels and things like that, somebody can get in the channel and just ask you privately a question. So make sure you're open to all those things as well from the very beginning. So if you have that set up straight, I think you're in a good position. Down the line, only time can tell. But if you have the base right, then I think you'll be right.
That's great.
Yeah, and I'd say just make sure that you're clear from the start about what your intentions are and how being an open source project ties into those. So maybe open source, maybe you're excited about open source because of the community. Maybe you believe that it's a good way to commercialization because it will help with the initial adoption. Maybe there are philosophical reasons that you have to pursue that. But I would say, make sure that you understand what those reasons are, and then that you look critically at what you're intending to get out of that, and make sure that it, as you game some things out, that it does align with those goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much, gentlemen. This was a great conversation and full of useful information for anybody thinking about starting an open source project. I want to thank everybody again for being here. It's been a real honor.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Leonard, Zach, pleasure to meet you folks over the wire. Much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Take care.